All things Colin's Last Stand, the YouTube gaming series SideQuest, the PlayStation podcast Sacred Symbols, the nostalgia and retro podcast Knockback, and the eclectic interview series Fireside Chats are brought to you by thousands of patrons of CLS at patreon.com/colinslaststand. If you like any or all of what I do, please consider supporting CLS on Patreon. Not only does your support allow the CLS brand to continue, but it nets you perks too, such as exclusive podcasts, early ad-free podcast access, the ability to vote on show topics and submit mail to the shows, and much more. Thank you for your kindness, generosity, and support. I truly appreciate it. Now, on to the show. Over on Patreon, I let supporters vote on topics that I'll cover on future episodes of SideQuest. Last week, we did one such episode, and we're going to do another one this week, this time surrounding Star Wars video games and the game developers that could best do the famous, decades-old, beloved IP justice. The fact is, Electronic Arts' monopolization of Star Wars, under the direction and guidance of Disney, hasn't been good for the brand or for players. The deal between Disney and EA was inked way back in 2013, and while both corporations are no doubt hauling in the cash, they aren't exactly hauling in critical love or goodwill. On the contrary, EA's poor handling of Star Wars has instead infested some of its other offerings, with broad skepticism surrounding games like Battlefield 5 and Anthem. These are instances that would have been unlikely if EA actually delivered on its Star Wars franchise monopoly, but it hasn't. 2015 Star Wars Battlefront sold huge, but it was also a woefully empty and one-note game, and its sequel, released in 2017, wedged in a ton of ill-conceived microtransactions and possibly one of the most half-baked single-player campaigns I've encountered in years. It also sold considerably worse than its predecessor. Meanwhile, EA shuttered renowned studio Visceral Games, best known for the Dead Space trilogy, while it was working on an Amy Hennig-led third-person action-adventure game in the Star Wars universe, Uncharted style. While EA Vancouver is apparently working on the remnants of that game, perhaps making it sprawling and open world, EA was so desperate for good press in regard to its handling of Star Wars that it interviewed Vince Zampella, overlord of EA-owned Respawn Entertainment, during its E3 press conference from the audience clearly planned 5 minutes prior. This amateurish move in turn netted the announcement of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and it's reportedly coming out in time for the 2019 holiday season. Naturally, we'll see about that. The point is, gamers deserve better, just as moviegoers have deserved better than, say, Episode 8. And while Disney recently announced that it's going to slow down with Star Wars releases and be a little more deliberate in their otherwise chaotic approach, perhaps that gives us an awesome chance to do the same thing with Star Wars games, even if we're just, unfortunately, making believe. It's easy to throw out huge, obvious studios making gigantic blockbuster games, but not only would that make for a lame video, but also a lame game universe. The beauty of Star Wars is how big it all is, but how small it can all feel. Part of the reason why both Rogue One and Solo were so good were because they chose to focus on minuscule aspects of enormous stories. By dividing and conquering, Star Wars and video games can again mix together in great harmony, just as they've done many times in the past. And I truly believe with a smaller, more methodical, and more deliberate approach, studios you might not think of can make games you may never have conceived of, in genres you may never have considered before. So in this video, I'm going to pitch you 7 games. A stealth game, an arcade shooter, an adventure game, a fighting game, an MMO, a single-player shooter, and something unknown at the end. I'm presenting these games in alphabetical order based on the developers that I think should take the reins, using footage from their previous titles, and I ask you to keep an open mind. Because Star Wars deserves much better than it's been getting, and I think it could start with bolder and unusual ideas such as these. Story-based first-person shooters are nothing new, and they're especially nothing new for Ukrainian studio 4A Games, the team responsible for the Metro series, beginning with 2010's Metro 2033. Metro is based on an acclaimed Russian-language post-apocalyptic series of novels, and it's that fact, combined with the fine nature of 4A Games' offerings, that make them an appealing developer in a new Star Wars-focused squad of studios. While shooting your friends online can be fun, that's about all Star Wars Battlefront and its sequel offer. What's even more fun and more compelling than that, than more of the same online bro-shooter facsimiles that the industry simply doesn't need, is a lengthy, narrative-driven first-person perspective shooter that, like Metro and its sequel Last Light, treats players like adults, expertly balances difficulty, and weaves a story that pulls even the most reluctant players through. And hey, since 4A Games has shown so much respect to the IP that spawned its game, why wouldn't they also hold the renowned Star Wars license in the highest regard, and treat it exactly the same? Episodes 7 and 8 have largely squandered what could perhaps be its single coolest feature, at least from a character perspective. A turncoat stormtrooper that betrays his cause for, when it comes to the movies, a higher and more virtuous purpose. But what could 4A Games do with a similar theme? Imagine a game that begins on a Star Destroyer, with a stormtrooper turning on his commanding officer and his peers, figuring out a way to get off the ship and landing on an unfriendly planet. Interested in making contact not with the rebellion, but with underworld elements that could enrich him, players indeed take the role of a Finn-like traitor, but one that isn't out for the good guys, but for himself. By pacing the game slowly, by relying on wit instead of force, and by emphasizing not narrative choice but rather gameplay choice, 4A Games could deliver a single-player Star Wars experience in the first person that DICE simply proved unable to with its dreadful campaign in Battlefront 2. Yes, we've had a Star Wars fighting game before, and yes, it wasn't very good. For those of you too young to remember, the original PlayStation was graced with a game called Masters of Terrascasi in 1997, and pretty much everyone hated it. While there are fighting-like modes in other Star Wars games thereafter, the idea of a Star Wars fighting game, an actual real fighting game, started and ended there. Which is why I feel like it'd be up to an unusual studio to make an unusual hardcore game that got the attention and love of the vaunted FGC, and spread from there. For some reason, the studio that comes to mind for me here is Arc System Works, the Japanese team famous for its BlazBlue and Guilty Gear franchises. Arc System Works games are renowned for their beauty, their depth, and their playability. They aren't the friendliest games to newcomers, but that's the point. Not everything branded Star Wars needs to be for the lowest common denominator. Apart from their track record and pedigree, there are two things that are most appealing to me when considering Arc System Works, and the potential they'd have to make a super cool Star Wars fighting game. For starters, the team would inject some Japanese sensibilities into an IP that, while obviously influenced by Eastern designs and philosophies, is dominated by Western creative forces, both in films and in games. I'd love to see Luke Skywalker or Han Solo in that classic Arc look. But beyond that, one of Arc System Works' most beloved games outside of its staple IP is Persona 4 Arena, a fighting game based on the incredibly popular JRPG. Persona purists loved the way Arc System Works treated the Persona franchise in that game. They loved the care to attention and the level of detail exhibited. Imagine, if you will, how that could translate to Star Wars, and how with such a robust roster of characters at their disposal, the Arc team in Yokohama could wow global audiences by rendering Star Wars in a brand new way. The MMO space isn't quite the beast it used to be, but it's still trucking along nicely, with many dedicated audiences of players around the world attached to, often for years at a time, a single game. And even in the realm of Star Wars, MMOs aren't unheard of. Star Wars: The Old Republic has been trucking along since 2011, and was probably the single product used to prove to Disney that EA could treat Star Wars well, since it was an EA-owned studio, BioWare, that developed the game to begin with. But man, when I think of MMOs, I can only think of one company that made a game so complex and so daunting that it could be argued it's more fun to read about it than actually play it. That company is Icelandic studio CCP, and it's their signature game, EVE Online, that could act as a sorta kinda prototype for a new type of Star Wars MMO, one developed from a place of enormous depth, but one that makes just a bit more sense for a wider audience. Everyone needs to make money, after all. See, the thing that's so interesting about EVE Online is how incredibly dedicated and even obsessed its audience is. Its audience isn't anywhere close to being the biggest in MMOs, it's not even in the conversation, but it's the stickiness EVE Online has with its audience of hundreds of thousands that simply cannot be ignored. Take the kernel of EVE and let CCP create a spacefaring MMO that's all about galactic trade, politics, alliances, and of course fighting in space, but in the Star Wars universe. It should be hyper-focused and as complex and deep as you want it to be, but it should also be accessible, with much more attention paid to getting people into the front door and ingratiated into the experience, something CCP and its aging EVE Online product has perpetually, and perhaps even proudly, failed to do. In a gaming climate where staying power is everything, and where Me Too's and copycats float to the top briefly and then go away forever, playing a Star Wars MMO should be a true investment. And who better to invest with than CCP, a team with a vibrant MMO 15 years old and counting. One of my very favorite gaming studios in the entire world is the Finnish team Housemarque, founded in the mid-90s and best known for a string of digital hits on PlayStation Network ranging from Super Stardust and Dead Nation to Resogun and Matterfall. These games, and pretty much everything else it developed, are what we'd call arcade games or arcade experiences, score-chasing feats of digital dexterity. Housemarque wasn't out to tell a story or deliver an hours-long experience. Quite the contrary, for Housemarque was all about making you do the same few things over and over again, until you mastered the task before you. It's the stuff of absolute addiction, and more than a few people fell into the Housemarque hole over the years, obsessing over leaderboards, chasing their friends on the charts, and besting their own abilities. In a hypothetical Star Wars games universe where not everything needs to be AAA and with $100 million budgets, Housemarque and Star Wars are a marriage made in heaven. Now, you may notice that I'm talking about Housemarque in the past tense, and there's a reason I'm doing so, even if they still thankfully exist. They've decided to pivot entirely away from their arcade stylings because they think it's the key to their long-term survival. But I say, fuck that. Housemarque is the undisputed master of the twin-stick shooter and the modern arcade game, and in my hypothetical situation, it's the Star Wars IP and the promise of financial stability that could bring the team that would bring them back from the brink, so they could create 1 or maybe 2 or even 3 arcade experiences. They could be simple, really. I mean, think of Resogun or Super Stardust, but with Star Wars ships. This is where we turn the dial up on pure fun and accessibility, but also turn it up to 11 when it comes to these games' addictive qualities and their ability to draw you back in. Perhaps I love Housemarque just a little too deeply, but either way, if it takes Star Wars to get them to come back, well, I say we just give it to them. Remember what I said earlier about having the audacity to think small? Star Wars requires small thinking more often than not, because while the Star Wars universe, well, galaxy really, is vast and fascinating on a macro level, it's potentially millions of micro-level stories that make it all go, kinda like the real world. So when I think stealth games, I think small, really small. One protagonist acting alone or perhaps on behalf of a shadowy organization. One target, a dangerous person protected by goons but disassociated from, say, a global power structure. This is tantalizing stuff, and it's the stuff IO Interactive, recently liberated from the Square Enix publishing umbrella, could deliver on, just as it's delivered on its Hitman experiences for years now, perhaps most notably with 2016's Hitman, which proved to be a masterclass in a stealth genre that too few developers actually understand and can harness. One of the things that drew me into the 2016 Hitman was its presentation and its reliance on setup. There's an emphasis on production value, perhaps not aesthetically, but rather thematically. There's attention to detail that's completely insane. The level of game design in which a player is tasked to kill one person in any number of ways is extreme, especially in an industry that more often than not relies wholly on linearity, on one way of doing things. So why not allow IO Interactive to take that Hitman formula, a formula it's about to visit for the 7th time this fall with Hitman 2, and translate it to Star Wars? Let's infiltrate some bases, some diplomatic buildings, some secure compounds, and let's take out criminal bosses, Imperial agents, rebel spies, and all the rest. Star Wars is often loud, massive space battles, lightsaber duels, infantry crossfire galore. Remove all of that, remove all of the noise, all of the gaminess, and instead think about a single task at hand: kill your target. Do it how you see fit, and get out alive. It's perfect for Star Wars, and it's especially perfect to tell some contained one-off stories that could be delivered episodically to keep you coming back. Up to this point in the video, we haven't discussed story nearly enough to my liking, and that's where I want to draw in a hot and cold studio that, from my perspective, is recently off of their best game to date, Quantic Dream. Best known for PS3 exclusive Heavy Rain, Quantic Dream is a French studio that's all about games as a narrative experience and a narrative experience alone, and that makes complete 100% perfect sense when it comes to Star Wars. Action is fun, of course, and all of the games on the list focus on action in some way, shape, or form. Quantic Dream's Star Wars game wouldn't, though. It would focus on characters and on choices, on branching paths, and an extreme level of replayability, all of which you saw earlier this year in Detroit Become Human on PlayStation 4. Perhaps Quantic Dream's game could even be an official entrant into the new expanded universe, and find itself looked at as an important novel of sorts, but one you can play and experience, not just read. For some reason, I can't help but feel that Quantic Dream's game should take place on Coruscant, the capital, the center of power, the place that sends shockwaves through the rest of the galaxy with any moves it collectively makes. Perhaps you play as characters on different sides of a political battle. Perhaps it even takes place during the events of the original trilogy, and gives us a glimpse into, say, behind-the-scenes peace overtures between the Rebellion and the Empire, something never spoken about or even heard about elsewhere, perhaps because it was over before it really ever got started. How could David Cage and his team navigate a story that complex and that delicate? I'd imagine they do it very well, and with their traditional emphasis on replayability, on one-off scenes some people will see and others won't, there's a great deal of work that'd need to go into a product like this, but one that I feel would have a huge payoff in the end. Star Wars games always seem to emphasize action and even violence. There's nothing wrong with that, but it would be very cool to see a marked change of pace. The final game on this list is unknown, really, because it comes from a studio that's yet to officially take shape, The Initiative. As you may recall, The Initiative is an Xbox-exclusive, Microsoft-owned studio in my current town of Santa Monica, California, and by all accounts, the team there is going to ultimately come out with something gigantic, and it'll only be on Xbox and PC, of course. I find this tantalizing because of what console exclusivity, and the focus and support that comes along with that, did for Spider-Man on PS4, which was published by Sony, developed by a trusted second-party developer in Insomniac, and supported by the might of Marvel. It's very likely going to be PS4's best-selling exclusive ever released when the dust settles and when we look back at this generation. So imagine a situation where Microsoft got to take a swing at Star Wars with its brand new, shiny, talent-loaded studio. Imagine what that could do for the Xbox brand, a brand that's on the upswing for sure, but one that could definitely still use one final boost in the arm when it comes to exclusive games. What could this game be? Well, we've resisted the charms and the commercial importance of AAA third-person action and open-world games here, and I think it's safe to say that that's what the Initiative is going to create in the real world, particularly considering the pool of talent they're pulling from in Santa Monica, and keeping in mind the heritage of the person at the head of the studio who comes from Crystal Dynamics. With that range of know-how, it's hard to see how Xbox didn't hit a home run with the Star Wars license, delivering on something big, on something substantial, something Star Wars has never had before, really. For as overwhelmingly intriguing as a Star Wars games brand is that focuses on smaller games, you need your anchor, you need your big gun, you need your lighthouse, your beacon. This could be it, something Xbox strangely could call its very own.